Shalom, welcome to the Jewish Task Force, J.T.F. I'm Chaim ben Pesach, and we have with us again the great David ben Moshe. On this program, we're going to be discussing the two Americas and the two Israels, the America of the left and the America of the right, the Israel of the left and Israel of the right, and what the future is, because these two countries are on completely opposite trajectories, despite the fact that you would think that they should be going in the same direction. We're going to explain why. There's certain events that occurred that should make Israel go on the same path as the United States. But Israel's future looks very bright, and America's future does not look bright, despite Donald Trump. Donald Trump is doing some positive things, and he's certainly much better than the Democrats. And he certainly will slow down the negative trajectory. But America is going on a very negative path, despite Donald Trump. And we're going to explain that, how that hasn't changed with Trump's election. It's to a certain extent, he's improved it, but it hasn't changed. We're going to explain the whole thing, why America's in a lot of trouble, why Israel in the future the future for Israel, though, looks very bright, and what the reason behind that is. So I know it's a little bit of a complicated subject. You're going to have to put your thinking caps on, but this is going to be a very important subject that hopefully will arouse a lot of thinking. But before we get to that, this program is dedicated to a refuah shlema, complete recovery for Ashedina, Bat Violet, Shlomo ben Sarah, Ruth bat Sarah, Dorit bat Sarah, Ruven ben Shoshana. And to Ilui Neshamot, elevating of the souls for Sharon Mitman, Malka bat Meir, Allegra bat Shlomo, Daniel Nankin, Victor Chazdai, Pesach Zeh ben Dov, Lunita Adler, Shifra Hoffman, Ruven Hoffman, Barry Hoffman, Harab Mir Kahana, Rab Benjamin Kahana, Tzipora Fegi Bat Liba, Yosef Ben Meir, Robert Mittman, Dennis Shore, Robert Friedman, Charles Zolat, and Yair Levine. Well, the United States and Israel are both Western countries with relatively similar forms of government. I'm not going to get into these technical issues of how the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is elected versus how the U.S. Congress and the president are elected, but the basic principle is that they're elected by the people, and that elections are held and decisions are supposedly made. And you have two big camps in both countries. There should be an almost identical trajectory for the two countries. In other words, where the countries are going in the future, but there isn't. Israel is the only Western country, the only country in the Western world which has positive population growth. Jews are having babies in Israel. The average Israeli woman has statistically almost 3 babies per Jewish woman in Israel. The Jews who are religious and the Jews who live in Judea and Samaria have more babies than the Arab Muslim women. So there is a very strong positive trajectory there that you don't have in any other Western country. There is no country in Europe that has positive population growth. There is no Western country, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of them have negative population growth, all of them. Even traditionally Catholic countries like Ireland and Poland have very negative population growth now. I mean, there is a trajectory that is very negative for the whole Western world and for the white or Caucasian world. Very negative trajectory. More people are dying every year in all of these countries than are being born. And so, why is it that Israel stands out like this? That Israel does have a positive population growth figures, and that Israel seems to be on a positive trajectory. And it's not just the numbers of Jews being born in Israel, which are leading to population growth and making Israel's Jewish majority grow to a greater and greater majority. A little bit, Israel's Jewish majority is percentage-wise is growing a little bit every year too. It's not just the numbers that look positive, the sheer numbers versus the numbers in the United States, in Germany, England, France, Spain, Italy, Russia, all these other countries, all negative, all going down. The numbers look much better in Israel than in these other countries, but it's not just the numbers, it's also the quality. What do I mean by quality? The type of Jews that are having babies in Israel are the ones that are having in greater numbers are the religious, even though non-religious It's amazing. Even non-religious Jewish women in Israel have positive population growth. There's something about Israel that inspires people to have families and have babies. Baruch Hashem. Thank God. Baruch Hashem. But in other words, the numbers of the people you want to be growing in the population, even among the Jewish population, they're the right-wing Jews. They're the religious Jews. They're the ones who are growing. The left-wing Jews in Israel, the Tel Aviv left-wing Jews, they're not having babies. They're like the whites, your white Europeans and white Americans and others that are shrinking. Whereas the right-wing Jews, the religious Jews, the ones that serve in the army and love the country, or the ones that are Haredim, they don't serve in the army, but they're religious. Those are the ones that are growing. Whereas in the United States and in Europe, the opposite is taking place, even in terms of quality. The United States population is growing every year. The total population of the United States is growing every year because Latinos, blacks, Asians, and non-whites are growing in population.
You left out Muslims.
Muslims are all growing in population, whereas the white, non-Hispanic whites are shrinking every year. Plus, and that's just from births, plus over 90% of the immigrants coming to the United States every year, both legal and illegal, are non-white and from third world countries. So the trajectory is overwhelming here. And that's in the United States, and in European countries, the same pattern. As of now, the United States is about 57% non-white, non-Hispanic whites, about 57%, and 43% non-white. Those are the figures. When I was a kid, it was 90% versus 10%. When I was a little boy, 90% white, 10% non-white. Now it is 57% white, 43% non-white. Now, by the way, when I say white and all these other, I'm not a racist. I really am not. I don't hate people because of the color of their skin. The color of someone's skin doesn't interest me. What interests me is literally what the content of their character, what Martin Luther King plagiarized in his speech. He wrote, "I have a dream that the day will come when my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." That's what Martin Luther King said in his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, all of which was plagiarized, by the way. And all of the quotes from the Bible, he puts a lot of quotes in the Bible in there. Every single quote is from the Jewish Bible. Okay. But anyway, but I do judge people based on the content of their character. I don't care about the color of someone's skin. I don't care about their ethnicity if they're a righteous person. If they're an evil person, I also don't care. I'll be against them if they're an evil person. I don't care who they are, including my fellow Jews. And you see us on this program, we attack evil Jews even more vigorously than we attack evil Gentiles. So I really do judge people by the content of their character. But by the content, but even in terms of character, the overwhelming majority of even the overwhelming majority of young people in the two countries are going in opposite directions between Israel and the United States. Israel, the younger you are, the more right-wing you are. In Israel, about 70% of the young people vote for parties or claim to take positions that are regarded as so-called right-wing. I say so-called right because for me it's not right-wing enough at all. But so-called right-wing, about 70% of young people in Israel, whereas 30% are on the other side. And the number that take positions that are so-called right is growing. This number, that 70% is growing a little bit every year. Because the religious and the right-wing Jews are the ones having the babies. In the United States, the opposite is true. Most young people are Democrats. Most young people vote Democrats. Most young people voted against Donald Trump in the last election. He lost the youth vote, and Republicans have lost the youth vote in every election since the 1980s. The 1980s, because Ronald Reagan was winning the youth vote big. But starting in the 1990s with Bill Clinton and onward, in every single election, young people vote Democrat. In other words, the future you see the future, left-wing trajectory. So even quality, it's not only quantity that looks bad for America and the Western world and that looks good for Israel, it's also quality. Israel's quality is improving, America's quality is, and Europe's quality and Western world's quality going down.
In what should be the brightness of the future generation, they're coming out of school as dumb as a box of rocks. I mentioned how we had someone who couldn't tell time. They don't know how many continents there are. They don't know who we won our independence from. That was one of the most basic things we learned in school every year, American history, in those days called social studies. But it was a little more involved as you got older because there was more to memorize. And today, these kids know nothing about our history. They can't do basic arithmetic. They can't write cursive. They can block print. That's about it. They don't know English. They don't talk no good English, as we say in New York. But this is the future of this country. Besides all the third worlders here, the kids that are graduating school today have nothing to offer this country.
And all true. And again, what we see is something so we see a very strange situation here. Now, what is the reaction of people on the right and on the left? What is the reaction? In Israel, the left is panicking. The left meaning the news media, the Supreme Court, the heads of the Israeli army, all the generals. You can't be a general in Israel unless you're leftists. All of the institutions, the educational institutions, the union, the labor unions, all panicking because they see that they're losing control of the country that they dictatorially controlled for so long, and they're losing control. They see that the future is not going to be theirs just from simple demographics that are taking place. So they're panicking. That's why they're out in the street demonstrating all the time. And we call them the Kaplanistim, the ones who demonstrate on Kaplan, which is a street. They're out there in Tel Aviv, huge demonstrations. I mean, you see all of these middle-aged and elderly Israelis demonstrating and screaming, Netanyahu is a Nazi and Bibi is a Nazi, and screaming and yelling and hating, filled with hatred. And they're desperately trying to stop this process because they'd rather have no Israel than an Israel that's truly Jewish. So that's, in Israel, you see on the left, they're panicking. In America, the side that's losing, which is the so-called right, they also are having a backlash, and their backlash was expressed through the election of Donald Trump. They elected Donald Trump. And again, what the things Donald Trump is trying to do, most of the things he's trying to do are positive for the country in terms of immigration, the borders, a lot of the changes, DEI, the transgenders, a lot of the changes he's making are much more positive than what we saw. I wish he had done this. He didn't do this in his first term, unfortunately. Now he's really aggressively doing it. I think he realized his first term was a flop when it comes to all of this. But now he's aggressively trying. So a lot of things he's doing are positive, but again, it's not enough. It's too little, too late. And it's a really serious problem. Why? But why are we in this situation? Why isn't Israel going down the same path as every other country in the West? How is this that Israel is the exception to the rule? How could that be possible? Because you see the Jews, and by the way, the Jews, it's not a Jewish thing because the Jews in America are shrinking even faster than any other group. They're assimilating, intermarrying, they're not having babies. They're shrinking faster than anybody, the Jews in America. And the Jews in Europe, the same story. And the Jews all around in every other country. It's only the Jews in Israel that are positive, that are part of this positive, strong trend. What is this? How is this possible? Well, first of all, it's happening because of Judaism. Because the Jews who believe in Judaism have babies. And the Jews who believe in Judaism have continuity. They have something to continue and something to pass on to the next generation. And it's a powerful force. Judaism inspires this very powerful, positive energy and very positive outlook for the future of the world and insight. And that creates this situation here. Even though you would think that America and Israel should be on the same trajectory. For instance, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who's a phony right, complete fraud, pretends to be a right-winger, and stupid. There are stupid Israelis who think he's a right-winger. He's not a right-winger. He's a liar. He's a fraud. But Bibi Netanyahu, he is like the reincarnation of Lyndon Johnson when it comes to foreign policy. He's doing the same thing in Gaza, in Lebanon, everywhere else. His policies, foreign policies, similar to what Lyndon Johnson did in Vietnam and what Richard Nixon did in Vietnam. Same policies. So you would think you'd have the same result. America was bleeding in Vietnam for years and years under Johnson and Nixon, getting nowhere, not winning, not getting anywhere. And in the end, America lost the war in Vietnam.
After all, weren't allowed to win.
After all the sacrifice, after everything else, America lost in the end. It was a catastrophe. And it divided the country, and it bled the country, and the country paid a tremendous economic toll and a toll in every other area. It also created a generation of Americans, of young Americans who were anti-American, who hated the country, who went to mass demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people, the Vietnam moratorium protest in 1969 and other protests throughout the 60s and throughout the and into the early 70s. It created a movement of Americans who were violently anti-American, who hate their country. These are Americans who went to demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of young people in America went to demonstrations where the flag of the Viet Cong, the enemies of the United States, were being waved at the demonstration. It's like going to a demonstration with Al-Qaeda after 9/11. It was like going to a demonstration waving the flags of the Islamic State. Now we see, by the way, this young generation is now they're waving the flags of Hamas, which is also violently, but of course also wants to kill and murder every American and every non-Muslim. But this started, in the 60s and 70s, we saw the resurrection of the militant left in America. And it was generated by the Vietnam War. Before then, we had a militant left in the United States in the 1920s, and then in the 30s during the Depression, a militant left began to grow, socialists and communists. There was a big socialist and communist movement in the United States in the 1930s during the Depression. And what happened was, in the 1950s, we had what was called the McCarthy era. I know I'm saying things that seem very simple to people my age, but a lot of young people who weren't born then may not even know what I'm talking about. Okay, now J.T.Fers, by the way, are better educated and better informed, so they will know a lot of what I'm speaking about, but I'm going to go over it briefly anyway. In the 1950s, you had the McCarthy era, where if you were a communist, you'd be fired from your job. All types of things could happen. And people were afraid to be called communists. Communists, by the way, were put in prison for being members of the Communist Party. There was something called the Smith Act. And Gus Hall and all the heads of the Communist Party USA were put in prison with long prison terms for being members of the Communist Party, for being members of a party that is working actively to overthrow the United States government, which is a crime. And so people were being put in prison. People were being arrested. People were being fired from their jobs. People were being called in front of congressional committees where you had these southern congressmen and southern senators saying, "Are you ever were you a member of the Communist Party? Are you ever were you a member of the Communist Party?" And kept repeating that question. And the actors in Hollywood a lot of actors in Hollywood were saying, "Well, Senator, I feel that, are you ever were you a member of the Communist Party?" And they kept, shouting this at them. And they'd be called in front of these hearings. There were committees called the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was the name of the committee. House Un-American Activity, to investigate un-American activities if you were un-American. I mean, that was the 1950s.
And a lot of Hollywood stars were blacklisted and they didn't make pictures anymore.
A lot, many. And so we had a whole anti-communist backlash in this country because the communists had a lot of influence in the entertainment industry and other industries, and the American people were made aware of it. And Joe McCarthy made a lot of them aware of it, although he went overboard. He unfortunately did a lot of crazy things as well, and in the end died in a mental asylum, or not a mental asylum, but an asylum for. He was in a home. He was in one of these places where I forgot what you call it, where you were trying to overcome alcoholism, and he died.
Rehab.
Rehab or whatever it is, yeah, and he died there. Now, if they're McCarthy supporters, I don't know if there are many in this day and age, so many years later, but if the McCarthy supporters are going to get mad at me, but I'm sorry. Joe McCarthy, he blew it. He had a chance to really make America permanently anti-communist, and he blew it. He didn't handle it. He didn't handle it well. I mean, if you look at the U.S. versus Army hearings and the other hearings that took place, he didn't handle it well. But anyway, the bottom line is, but he did create strong anti-communism was so strong in this country that in 1960, John F. Kennedy, the Democrat candidate for president, was running against Vice President Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. Nixon was the Republican candidate for president. Kennedy was the Democrat candidate for president. Kennedy was claiming that Eisenhower and Nixon were not doing enough to overcome the Soviet threat and the threat of communism. Kennedy said that just as Abraham Lincoln said, a nation cannot live half slave and half free. He said the world cannot live half slave and half free. In other words, he was calling for victory over communism and defeating communism worldwide, and was saying we have to build up our missiles and build up our military defense, and that Eisenhower and Nixon are not doing enough in that area. And Nixon was countering, no, we are building up, and we are. That was the campaign. That was the campaign in 1960. That is what people spoke about in 1960. That's the America that once existed. Of course, Kennedy was a liar and a fraud. His whole family are just disgusting liars and frauds, and he didn't build up America's military when he became president and so on. But anyway, the bottom line is then what happened? Okay, America, because of that, America was growing and America was prospering, and everything was going great until the 1960s. By the way, America had like 2,500 nuclear missiles against like 500 that the Soviets had. And America's nuclear missiles much more accurate, America's weapons much more accurate than the Soviet weapons. America was vastly superior to the Soviets, even though many Americans thought, oh, we're falling behind. And Kennedy claimed we were falling behind. But America was vastly superior to the Soviets. That really was the situation. And America was winning. And all these things seemed to be moving in a positive direction until we had the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Lyndon B.B. Johnson. I say Bibi, not Baines. Bibi like in Bibi Netanyahu. Lyndon Netanyahu Johnson became president of the United States. And he started his plan. First of all, in foreign policy, the Vietnam War. He dragged that war on. America could have won that war in several months. If America had invaded North Vietnam, destroyed all of North Vietnam's industry, all the ability of them to get weapons from the Soviet Union and Communist China, America could have won that war in several months, easily. He would not invade North Vietnam. He fought the war only in South Vietnam. The North was invading the South, and the North had communist Viet Cong terrorists in the South, and they were fighting the war, a guerrilla war, in the South. And Johnson would not invade North Vietnam because he thought, no, you can't invade that. We can't do that. That you can't do. Invade. What is he? Why not? The country committed aggression. You got to put the country out of business. Of course you're supposed to invade. But instead he dragged the war on and dragged the war. And what happened? American kids were being drafted in huge numbers. So they didn't want to be drafted. They didn't want to go off to the jungles of Vietnam to fight some war that's dragging on and on. Justifiably, they didn't want to do that. The war in Vietnam was crazy the way it was being fought. The way it was being fought was crazy. America could have won and should have won, but that was not the plan. It was dragging on, and Americans were getting tired. On the news, you would see the names of all the American soldiers that had been killed that week. You'd see lots of names of American soldiers killed, American soldiers who lost limbs, wounded, seriously wounded. Americans were getting tired of seeing this week after week. And American kids did not want to go off to Vietnam to be part of this. And so mass protests and mass demonstrations started taking place against the Vietnam War. And it led to the radicalization of many American youth who became supercharged leftists and who started hating their country. They went to demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people where the American flag was burned, and where thousands of young people, thousands of very privileged, upper middle class, white American kids would be cheering while the American flag was burned. Those are demonstrations they went to. That is what had happened. In other words, you saw the resurrection of the communists in the United States. What McCarthyism had killed in the 1950s was resurrected by the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And so this thing dragged on and on and on. Same thing in Israel. Netanyahu has the same policy in Israel, in Lebanon, and in Gaza. Israel could have won the Gaza war in 2 or 3 days. Israel captured Gaza in 1956 and 1967 in a half a day. In a half a day, captured Gaza. Israel could have done this in several days, easily. Instead, it's a year and a half already, and soldiers are killed, and it goes on and on and on, and there are negotiations for hostages and back and forth. Now, dragging on. Netanyahu is doing what Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon did in Vietnam. Richard Nixon was elected president after Lyndon Johnson, and continued that policy of letting the war drag on for no reason. Netanyahu's doing the same thing. So you would think, why isn't Israel becoming just like what happened in the United States? Why aren't we seeing the same thing happen in Israel? Because the soldiers and the young people in Israel are right-wing, because they're inspired by the Bible and by Judaism. They believe in the state of Israel and in the land of Israel. They love their country and love Judaism and are proud to be Jews. And so they're not reacting the way young Americans reacted. Young Americans reacted that way because young Americans didn't have any real religious belief or ideological belief to fall back on. What was America? What was Europe, America, the Western world? Materialism. Materialism, the music of the 1950s. If you go to the 1950s, what was 1950s? All materialism. Where were the spiritual values? Where are the values you could fall back on? There were patriotic values in the 1950s? Give me a break. For what? What were the patriotic values? What were these? Because America's free, a free country, freedom. Freedom means I have freedom to do anything I want. If you really want to push the issue of freedom, that's how a young person will think of it. Young people think in absolutes. Where were the values to fall back on in the 60s when young people were confronted by this dilemma? There weren't any values to fall back on. Now, there are young people in Israel that do react like this as well, but it's a minority of the young people in Israel. It's a distinct minority. Most young people in Israel are reacting the opposite way. They want more right-wing. They're reacting the opposite. And you don't see Israelis going to demonstrations and burning Israeli flags. Even the left in Israel doesn't dare do that. So, it's a different trajectory and a different mentality because of Judaism. Because Judaism has given these young Jews something to fall back on, something to believe in. And many of them, by the way, they don't believe in what Judaism really wants. Judaism is really Kahanism, what Rabbi Kahana, our blessed rabbi, preached. But someday when they get that, you can imagine what Israel will turn into when they get that. someday, and someday they will get that. But in the meantime, despite the fact that you have similar policies, the leaders, traitor leaders in America like Johnson and Nixon, or traitor leaders in Israel like Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett, pursue same treasonous policies. And yet the result is Israel is still growing, and the long-term prospects for Israel are still good. The long-term prospects for America are not good, the way things are going now. By the way, America's 57% is now 57% white. And I'm only mentioning that because the third world people bring a different culture to the country, and it will change the country when that happens. And they tend to be Democrats and tend to be on the left, whereas the white population tends to be Republican and tends to be on the right. Not because I care. I don't care. Again, I do not care about the color of someone's skin. I care about the content of their character. Now, but the United States, 57% white now. United States, what's going to happen when the United States is 45% white? What's going to happen when what happened to California will happen to the United States? California was overwhelmingly white, and Ronald Reagan was governor, and the country was like paradise. In the 70s, he was governor. In the 80s, he was president. And the country, California was like paradise in those days.
It was called the Golden State, and people went to California because they wanted to live the California dream. Well, that dream turned out to be a nightmare decades later.
No, absolutely. And California, by the way, even when you had recessions, you had some very serious recessions in the United States. In the 1970s, for instance, with the oil embargo, and we had oil, gas, and we had long lines at gas stations, and you had the Iranian Revolution, 1979, another oil crisis, and oil prices doubled overnight. You had some very serious periods of double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, very brutal recessions. People were losing jobs. You had some in the 70s. America went through a very rough time economically. California didn't. California was one of the only places in America that was always called the recession-proof state. The recession that hits everywhere else doesn't hit in California, because California is so resilient economically and so powerful economically. It doesn't. That was what was true of California until the 1980s and 1990s. Then suddenly, the third world majority took over in California. California became a super left Democrat state now, where Republicans can't get elected to any statewide office and haven't been elected to statewide offices for decades, except for Arnold Schwarzenegger. He ran as a Republican, but he's an anti-Trump leftist. That's the only type of so-called Republican that can get elected in California. I mean, California now is just like a garbage dump. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible place with gangs and crime and drugs and huge numbers of homeless encampments that stretch for miles and miles and miles. I did some videos on San Francisco and Los Angeles. I don't know if everybody saw the videos that I did where I showed pictures of what it's like. It's unbelievable what that state has turned into. That's that. But what happened to California is also the story of America as a whole. The same thing is going to happen to America as a whole. When America becomes majority third world, and when we have a third world culture taking over the United States, when that happens, a president like Donald Trump will never have any chance of even coming close to the White House. It'll be all over. Both houses of Congress will be overwhelmingly Democrat. The president will be a Democrat. The only Republican who'll be able to get elected to anything will be a Republican who is a left-wing Republican who pretends to be a Republican but is really a leftist. That's where the country's. So you'll have the type of government and the type of elected officials you have in New York and California and Massachusetts. What a nightmare. By the way, to show you what a nightmare that is, all of those states now run by Democrats, all those left-wing states, everybody's running away from them, everybody's fleeing. Millions of people are leaving those states and moving to the states where you have the Republican governors like Texas and Florida. Millions are fleeing and going to places where you have the Republicans in charge. But what's going to happen when there's nowhere to flee? What's going to happen when Texas, the Texas majority non-white already? Florida's on the way. What's going to happen when there's nowhere to run to? Everybody's going to move to Wyoming? I guess you could move to Wyoming and Idaho, but not most Americans wouldn't want to live in Wyoming or Idaho. They wouldn't want to live there because it's just not Americans who are urbanized and most Americans would not be able to get used to the life out there.
And the winters are brutal.
Right. The winters are brutal, and it's most Americans could, even though they're beautiful they're both Idaho, Wyoming, Montana are beautiful states. Beautiful states. Nice places to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there in most cases, like the old saying. So
we have a woman that moved to California a few years ago. She's a table tennis player, like an advanced basement player, not really very good. Her husband, she's a real estate agent, and they moved from here to California quite a few years ago, and now they're looking to come back. She was at table tennis last Friday because later in the afternoon, they were going to look at a house here. And I said to them, why'd you go to California? You were living here. And she said she wanted to live the California dream. I said, well, that dream became a nightmare. And she said, you're right. That's why we're coming back here. And they were going to look at a house. Money was no object. They just wanted to get out. $1,250,000 for a house. That could have been a palace here 15 years ago when we moved here. But now it's just a nice size house.
Most Americans don't have that type of money. And that's the overwhelming majority of Americans don't. In fact, 50% of Americans would have a hard time coming up with $1,000 in an emergency. That's the latest survey. And about 50% of Americans are in debt on their credit cards. So, we have an economic situation that's very painful and difficult. Israel also has. That Israel also has the economic situation. But, even if you're economically in bad shape, if you have a positive outlook and you love the country like Israelis do, and you believe in something, you believe in God, and you believe in the Bible, you can overcome a lot of things when that's true. Whereas when you don't have that, which Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans don't have, you can't overcome anything. So it's, in the meantime, we want to promote the ultimate example of Jewish idealism in Israel. That is the example they're setting the example for the whole world, the Hilltop Youth. Look at this, thousands of young, brilliant, and Jewish kids are smart. David always tells us about all the kids who don't know anything from school. You should see the Israeli Jewish kids that I speak to, who start telling me about the differences between Saadia Gaon and Hebrew philosophers and Aristotle and Socrates and the Greek philosophers, and they start going into all this detail and about the revolt of Bar Kokhba and the Roman Empire, and which empire do you think was more advanced? Mesopotamians or the Babylonians? One kid just asked me this question a few days ago, a 17-year-old Israeli kid. You think the Mesopotamians or the Babylonians? How many American youth do you know who would ask me about the Mesopotamian Empire and the Babylonian Empire?
They wouldn't even know what it is.
They don't even know what Mexico is. 1/3 of American, this is true, 1/3 of American high school graduates could not tell you what country borders the United States on the southern border. 1/3 didn't know. I think almost 40%.
I saw them ask kids, like high school graduate, early college age, not in college, but college age, and they had no idea that Canada was on the north and Mexico was on the south. One knew Mexico bordered the south, had no idea who bordered on north.
And by the way, I think it was 37 or 38% in one of the surveys. 37, 38. I think it was Ipsos. I don't remember which survey it was, but 37 or 38%. These are high school graduates. What about all the people that don't graduate? Which is a large percentage as well. But these are high school graduates, okay? 37 to 38%, when shown the map of the world, couldn't find the United States on the map. They didn't know where the United States is. Some of them pointed to Europe. Some of them pointed to Africa. There were even some who pointed to Antarctica. I mean, so the difference is so profound. So Jewish kids, these are smart kids, the Hilltop Youth. They're brilliant. I mean, you should see how they write articles. Wow. I mean, just brilliant. I just read an article. Of course, articles are in Hebrew. I just read an article by one of the Hilltop Youth, writing in one of their in one of the on Shabbat in the synagogues. They hand out things that you can read on Shabbat, and he writes a column for one of them. Which, anyway, J.T.F. helps with that because you have to pay for the column. But anyway, J.T.F. helps spread the Hilltop Youth message, of course. But he wrote a column, and there were two words in his column that I had to look up the meaning. I didn't even know. So what does that mean? I didn't know the meaning. Two words that I didn't know. And I'm 68 years old. I mean, I've been reading these things and studying these things for a long time, and I'm 68 years old, and I didn't know the meaning of these words. I think this guy was 20 years. I think he's 20 years old. He already has 3 children, by the way. He's 20 years old. He has 3 kids already. So they start early in Israel. Anyway, don't you want to support the force of idealism that sets an example for the whole world and that someday will become the light unto the nations that Israel was meant to be? Don't you want to support that and be part of that? If you're not on those hilltops, if you're not part of that, don't you at least want to support that? Know that you have a connection to that, that you're playing a role in helping with that. Don't you want to be able to tell God on the day of judgment that you helped with that you helped with that great project? We're giving you a chance to do that here every week when you watch J.T.F., when you come to our videos, we give you a chance to do that. You'll believe me, the Hilltop Youth will do more for you than you'll do for them. Think of all the things that you spend money on during the week or during the year that were a waste of money, that were nonsense. This is not a waste of money. This really is worthwhile. First of all, you should leave J.T.F. in your will. Put J.T.F. in your will. Set aside money in your will for J.T.F. to help the heroic Hilltop Youth, to help these wonderful heroes who've given up, by the way, these brilliant young Jews that I'm telling you about, with their discipline and all their Jewish brains. They could easily go into the high-tech world and become multimillionaires, and they could do that. They have the brains to do it. They gave up everything to live on remote hilltops and take care of goats and sheep so that they could prevent the Arabs from taking over, so they could block the Arabs from taking over, because if they weren't there, the Arabs would take over everything in Judea and Samaria, and we'd have a PLO terrorist state there, and Israel would be in suicidal boundaries. They gave up everything. They and their families and their beautiful wives, gave up everything, and are living there willingly, giving up everything to live to help their brothers and sisters, and to fight for justice and fight for righteousness and fight against Islamic Nazi evil. I mean, how could you not want to support these wonderful people? Leave J.T.F. in your will. And you can go to, right now you can go and immediately help, and you should. You go to our Hebrew main page, hayamin.org, and you click on the donate button. The donate button is in English on top. And on the donate button, there are 2 things you can do. One is you can have recurring monthly donations. All you do is click on an amount that you choose, and every month your credit card will pay that amount until as long as you want to keep it that way. Recurring monthly donations. That's one thing you could do, which I advise everybody to do. And the second thing you can do is make also one-time donations, which are also very important. You can do that as well. So you can make one-time donations and you can make recurring monthly donations. That's online at hayamin.org, and it's so easy and convenient to do. It's a wonderful thing you'll be doing in your life. If you don't want to do it online, you want to do it through the regular mail, you just make checks and money orders out to J.T.F. Make it out to J.T.F. and send it to J.T.F. P.O. Box 650327, Fresh Meadows, New York, 113 665. David?
Well, I wasn't even sure I was going to be ready for the show in time. Last week, my computer picked up a really bad virus. There was no way to get rid of it and get the computer running again. So I had to delete everything and reinstall everything. And I've had computers going back to the mid 90s. So,
Were you backed up? Did you have a backup for everything?
oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
But you have apps and programs that you download, and you have to have the license to reinstall them. So you got to gather all that information to get ready to reinstall. So Friday night, I backed everything up, the things that I needed backed up. And Saturday, Sunday, and yesterday afternoon, I was reinstalling. I wasn't even sure this camera and Zoom was going to work. And I think I'm as good looking as ever. I didn't make any adjustments. This is just how it comes out. So I only have a few things. I wasn't sure I was going to have anything in time. But a hapless anti-Elon Musk activist by mistake set himself on fire after throwing a Molotov cocktail at a Tesla charging station. So there is some good news. In Australia, an Afghan migrant asking for asylum raped an 18-year-old Aussie girl, and his penalty was he was fined the equivalent of 1,000 American dollars, no jail time. After all, he's a Muslim asking for asylum. And in Vienna, a migrant gang of Muslims gang raped a 12-year-old girl. This is what Islam does. Can you imagine when their numbers grow here to where they're bold enough to do these things? Meanwhile, the people that hate this country but don't leave, they stay here to hate it. I think we're the only country in the world where people hate it but don't leave. Maybe Israel are left there. They don't leave Israel either. They just hate it, and they're there to complain. Well, 158 House Democrats voted not to deport illegals convicted of sexual assault of minors. So the Democrat Party is not really the Democrat Party anymore. It's the anti-American party. You can call them anarchists, you can call them communists, but if you put them under the anti-American umbrella, you're covering it all. And the Republican House Speaker, Johnson, he said, if you're an aspiring terrorist here on a student visa just to attack Jews, you're going home. I hope he means it. I hope they're going to do it. And I hope some left-wing judge appointed by Biden or Obama doesn't stop this. And if you watch all the documentaries on back in the 40s, the 30s, the late 30s, in Nazi Germany, there were always a German here and a German there who would try and protect Jews, maybe take them into their house, risking their own lives, risking not being thrown into a concentration camp themselves. You don't see that with the Arabs, with the Muslims in Gaza. You don't see one trying to save the hostages or demand their release. Well, now a few thousand are marching because they're tired of being bombed. If Israel stops the bombing, just like Lyndon Johnson did with Vietnam, they won't be marching anymore to release the hostages. They'll probably try and assist in killing the hostages. But now, to protect their own hides, they're marching. They're tired of being bombed out of their own houses. And this should have happened in a few days. They should have been bombed out of their houses immediately. And I have 3 stories, because I don't have that much information. I had no computer to get it. When America, not America today, liberated Dachau, 2 inmates wearing the striped pajamas, 2 Jews who were in pretty good health, so obviously they were not there too long. They each picked up a shovel, and they took a SS guard and they beat him over the head. And the guy was on the ground pleading for his life. And they gave him the coup de grace. They beat him to death. Meanwhile, an American GI yelled, "No prisoners." They rounded up 60 guards. Many fled at this point, but they got 60 guards. And the first company lined up and shot them all down. A report was made and sent to General Patton. He ignored it. He knew it was the right thing to do. And in this America, not this, I mean, this America from the 1940s, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, there was a nurse, June Wandry. She signed up immediately to be a military nurse. And she said at that time, the military had 500 nurses. By 1943, there were 30,000 nurses. And she said it wasn't easy. She saw things no woman should see. She saw things no man should see either. These broken bodies with wounds, with their insides hanging out. One soldier was laying there, and he said, "Am I going to make it?" And she kissed him on the forehead, and she said, "Don't worry." And he said, "Okay, just checking." And then he died. She ran out crying, and she said she cried in her bunk with all the other nurses all night long. And yet they stuck it out, seeing these horrible sights. Her boyfriend fought in Italy, and she met him in the army, and he was badly wounded. I don't know what happened to him. They sent him back home. And I have one last story. Last week I told you Charles Schiffel was a Jew from Germany. He wasn't. He was an American. He was the lieutenant that wanted to shoot the Jew from Germany, not knowing he was Jewish, because the Jew from Germany who shot down the POWs, his name was Jack Warner, just like Jack Warner from Warner Brothers Studios. He took an American name because he had a very German-sounding name. And so they didn't know he was Jewish. But it was Jack Warner that shot down the POWs. And of course, nothing happened to him because he was Jewish. And Charles Schiffel was a lieutenant, eventually promoted to captain, and he got severely wounded. He got shrapnel wounds all over his body. And I'm leaving you with a good feeling. I like to leave a good story. And the explosion blew off his trigger finger, a good part of his trigger finger. He only had one to the first knuckle left. So they sent him back to the United States because he couldn't fight anymore without a trigger finger. So he's in Texas, and he calls his girlfriend and tells her to come down to Texas because he's going to be here a while. And Texas in those days, this is Austin, in those war days, you couldn't get a room in a hotel anywhere. He tried every hotel. Finally, in the St. Augustus Hotel in Austin, I don't even know if it's still there, he just sat down in the lobby for 3 hours. And a man came over to him and said, "Captain, you look like you have troubles." And he nodded yes. The man walked away, and he came back 5 minutes later with a key for a room. So Charles Schiffel called his girlfriend again and told her, "We have a room, we have a room." He found out when they got upstairs that it was a suite. So he had the room for free. And that was America in those days. Nothing like today. It's two different countries. Maybe we should change the name of this country because it has no relation to our first 200 years. Chaim?
Well, in your heart, you know we're right, and in your guts, you know they're nuts. For J.T.F. until next week, and for David Ben Moshe, Shalom.